I'm a 30-year-old woman, and for as long as I can remember, I've been the afterthought in my own family. My younger brother, Ryan 27M, was always the golden child. If he wanted something, he got it. If I needed something, I was told to figure it out myself. That was the unspoken rule of our household. Growing up, it wasn't just the little things, it was everything. When Ryan wanted a new bike, my parents got him the best model. When I needed one, they told me to save up my allowance. When he turned 16, they handed him the keys to a brand new car. When it was my turn, I took the bus. He never worked a part-time job a day in his life. Meanwhile, I was balancing school, babysitting gigs, and waitressing just to afford clothes that weren't hand-me-downs. College was no different. My parents covered Ryan's full tuition, books, apartment, everything. I had to take out student loans, work late shifts, and still somehow keep my grades up. And even after all that, when I finally graduated with honors, they didn't even bother showing up to my ceremony. They were too busy helping Ryan with his newest business venture, one of many that would crash and burn while they continued to support him. I spent years trying to earn their love, their approval, something. I thought that if I was a good daughter, if I helped them financially when they struggled, if I made time for them even when they didn't do the same for me, maybe things would change. They never did. No matter what I did, Ryan was the priority. But the moment that broke me, my wedding. I met my husband, Ethan, a few years ago, and he showed me what real love and support looked like. When we got engaged, I knew my family had never really been there for me, but I still wanted them to be. I wanted my parents in the front row, watching me walk down the aisle. I wanted my brother standing somewhere in the crowd, at least pretending to be happy for me. They RSVP'd? Yes, they promised they'd be there. And yet, when I turned to look at the seats reserved for them, they were empty. Not a call, not a text, nothing. Just gone. I tried to keep it together, smiling for the cameras, focusing on Ethan and the life we were about to start together. But I kept looking back, expecting them to rush in, to be late but at least show up. They never did. Days later, when I finally got a hold of them, my mom sounded annoyed that I was even asking. Apparently, Ryan had a small emergency. His dog had an upset stomach, and they couldn't just leave him alone. That was their excuse. That was the reason they skipped my wedding. When I told them how much it hurt, my mom laughed, said I was being dramatic and it wasn't that big of a deal. My dad didn't even say anything, just let out one of those sighs that made it clear he thought this was all a waste of time. Ryan? He just said, "You're not actually mad about this, right?" As if I was the crazy one. I don't know what snapped inside me at that moment, but I hung up. I blocked their numbers. I deleted them from social media. For the first time in my life, I decided I was done trying. And the worst part, they didn't even notice. Months passed. No calls, no texts, no apologies. It was like I had never existed to them. And then, a few weeks ago, my aunt called. She isn't someone I'm particularly close with, but she sounded hesitant, like she wasn't sure if she should even be telling me this. Apparently, things weren't going well for my parents and Ryan. She didn't give details, just that maybe it was time to talk, that maybe I should give them a chance to explain. I had no intention of hearing them out. I had given them years of chances, and they had wasted every single one. But then something shifted in my mind. At first, I told myself this was about closure. Maybe I needed to hear them acknowledge what they had done. But deep down, I knew I wanted to see if they had changed, if they had any regrets at all. And if they didn't, then at least I'd have my answer. So I agreed to meet them. One time. One chance. They didn't know it yet, but depending on what they said at that table, I was either walking away for good, or I was about to make them regret everything. The restaurant was already half full when I walked in, the low hum of conversation and clinking of silverware filling the space. My eyes scanned the room until I spotted them. My parents and Ryan were sitting at a corner table, looking exactly as I expected, tense, uncomfortable, like they were about to face something they wanted to avoid. My mom's eyes met mine first, and in an instant she forced a smile, the kind of smile she used when she was pretending everything was fine. Ryan was slouched back in his seat, arms crossed, staring at his phone like he had better places to be. My dad barely looked up, scrolling through something with that same detached expression he always had when he wasn't interested. I walked over, pulling out the chair across from them. No greetings, no forced pleasantries. Just straight to business. My mom was the first to speak, launching right into small talk, asking how my job was going, if I had any vacations planned, if Ethan and I were thinking about buying a house. Like nothing had ever happened. Like they hadn't ignored my wedding. Like this wasn't the first time we'd seen each other in nearly a year. I didn't answer. I just waited. Ryan was the one who broke the silence first, finally looking up from his phone with an amused smirk. Wow, so you're still mad about that wedding thing? He leaned back like this whole thing was one big joke. The air shifted. The restaurant noises faded into the background. I stayed calm. I wasn't here to lose control. I wasn't here to cry or beg for answers. I was here to see if they were capable of acknowledging what they'd done. I asked the only question that mattered. Do you even realize why I'm upset? Ryan rolled his eyes and sighed like I was being so unreasonable. My mom gave one of her dramatic sighs and shook her head. You always overreact to things. We had a family emergency. We can't drop everything for you all the time. A family emergency? I stared at her, waiting, giving her a chance to say something. Anything that would make it make sense. Nothing. So I said it for her. You're talking about Ryan's dog. You missed my wedding because of a dog. Ryan scoffed like that wasn't the full story. It wasn't just that, he said. I wasn't feeling well either. And then my dad, who hadn't said a word this whole time, finally looked up from his phone just long enough to shrug and say, "We just thought you'd understand." Understand? That was when it clicked. This wasn't about a misunderstanding. This wasn't about them making a mistake or forgetting or anything like that. They just didn't care. They had never cared. I had spent years thinking if I worked harder, if I was more patient, if I just gave them one more chance, maybe things would be different. But sitting across from them now, listening to them make excuses for something that should not have needed an excuse, I knew there was nothing left to salvage. I leaned forward, making sure they heard me clearly. This was your one chance to take responsibility. I said. You missed it. They exchanged confused glances, not getting it. Not understanding that this wasn't just another one of those family disagreements they could sweep under the rug. I reached into my purse, pulled out some cash, and dropped it onto the table. You'll regret this. Then I stood up and walked out, leaving them sitting there, still not grasping what had just happened. That night, I opened my laptop and started typing. I wasn't going to let them rewrite the narrative. I wasn't going to let them act like I was some dramatic, ungrateful daughter who just couldn't let things go. If they weren't going to be held accountable within the family, then the world was going to hold them accountable. I wrote everything. No exaggerations, no embellishments, just the truth. How they had always favored Ryan, how I had been treated like an afterthought, how they had chosen a dog over my wedding, and how they had sat there at that restaurant with zero remorse. I hit post. And then I waited. At first, the post got a few likes, a handful of comments from people saying they could relate. But then overnight, it started gaining traction. Someone must have shared it in a large group because suddenly notifications flooded my phone. More comments. More shares. By the time I checked again that evening, it had taken off in a way I never expected. Thousands of comments poured in, many from people who had been through the same thing. I thought I was the only one. My parents did this to me too. I cut my toxic family off years ago. Best decision I ever made. The post wasn't just being read, it was spreading. People were tagging each other, reposting it, adding their own stories. By the time I woke up the next morning, it had completely blown up. A few days passed before I started noticing missed calls from my mother. At first, they were spaced out, 1 or 2 a day, but as the post continued to spread, they became frantic. The texts started with simple messages, call me, now, but soon escalated into full-blown rage. Take it down immediately. You are making us look bad. Do you have any idea what you've done? Blocked. Ryan was next. A long, furious message came through, filled with all caps and exclamation points. Are you serious? Do you know how embarrassing this is? My job might see this. You literally ruining my life. Apparently, he cared more about his reputation than the fact that he and our parents had completely discarded me. At first, my dad was silent. No calls, no texts. He had always been the one to avoid conflict, acting like if he ignored a problem long enough, it would go away. But as the fallout grew, even he couldn't stay detached forever. When my mother's frantic attempts to control the damage failed, he finally reached out, not with an apology, but with an attempt to smooth things over. A single message, let's be reasonable about this support, came pouring in. Strangers messaged me, some thanking me for sharing, others telling me they were going through the same thing. Some people even gave me advice, sharing how they had successfully cut off their toxic families for good. Then my aunt texted, wow, I didn't think it would get this big. But honestly, I can't say I blame you. She didn't defend my parents, she didn't try to convince me to take it down. Just an acknowledgement that this was bigger than she had expected. By that evening, things had taken a turn. More calls, more messages. Then, the real fallout started. The family gossip train was in full motion. Extended relatives started hearing about it. Friends of my parents, even their old church group. Questions started coming their way, people wondering if it was true. Then Ryan called. The moment I picked up, he was already yelling. Someone at his job had seen the post. They confronted him about it at work. Take it down. His voice was shaking, not from anger, but from panic. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I just said one thing before hanging up. The truth hurts, doesn't it? Then came the guilt trip. My mother sending voice notes, her voice breaking. You're destroying this family. After all we've done for you, this is how you treat us. As if they had ever done anything for me. I ignored them. Every single one. Then, my dad finally broke his silence. One single phone call. His voice was flat, controlled. Like he was trying to act like this was no big deal. You've made your point. Now let's be adults and move on. Move on? After a lifetime of being treated like nothing? I replied, just as calm. Adults take responsibility. You didn't. Then I blocked him too. It was over. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I needed their love, their approval, anything. I didn't need them to admit they were wrong. I had something better. Regret. And yet, I wasn't finished. The post had done its job. But now, it was time to make sure everyone knew exactly who they were. I opened my laptop and started drafting an email. Not just to my parents. Not just to Ryan. To every extended family member. To old family friends. To anyone who had ever believed my parents were good people. This wasn't just about exposing them. This was about making sure they could never rewrite the story again. This time, the truth wasn't going anywhere. The email went out to everyone. Aunts, uncles, cousins, old family friends. Anyone who had ever been fed the lie that my parents were good, loving people. I didn't hold back. I laid everything out, detailing the years of neglect, the blatant favoritism, the way they treated Ryan like a prince, while I was left to fend for myself. And of course, I included the final insult, how they had RSVP'd to my wedding and then ghosted me for a dog. The responses came in fast. Some relatives were shocked. Messages poured in from cousins and distant aunts saying they had no idea it was this bad. Others were a little less surprised, subtly implying they had always suspected something was off but didn't want to get involved. Then came the reactions from my parents' so-called friends. One of their longtime family friends, a woman my mother had been close with for years, reached out, horrified. She couldn't believe they had missed my wedding over something so petty. Another messaged me privately, saying that while they had always liked my parents, this changed everything. That's when my phone started blowing up. My mother was in full meltdown mode. Missed calls, voicemails, frantic texts, all saying the same thing. What have you done? People are turning against us. This isn't fair. She was losing control of the narrative, and she knew it. Then my dad lost his indifference. For the first time in years, he actually showed real emotion, not concern, not regret, just rage. A voicemail came in, his voice shaking with anger. You ungrateful brat. You've ruined our reputation. You have no idea what you've done. I let the message sit there, I didn't respond, and while they were dealing with their social lives falling apart, Ryan was dealing with something much worse. A cousin messaged me privately, revealing something I had suspected for a while. Ryan had been mooching off my parents for years. The whole successful businessman act was just that, an act. He wasn't self-made, he wasn't independent. My parents had been quietly covering his rent, his car payments, even some of his credit card bills. And now, with their reputation crashing, his free ride was in serious danger. Then came the work fallout. Someone from Ryan's job, a coworker, maybe even a manager, must have seen the viral post because HR got involved. Turns out, his company took their reputation seriously. A meeting was scheduled, and Ryan was furious. The moment he found out, another angry call came through. He was screaming before I even said a word. "You ruined my career. Do you even care?" I waited until he ran out of breath, then asked one simple question. "What part of this isn't true?" Silence. Then a muttered curse before he hung up on me. Meanwhile, my mother was desperate to get ahead of the damage. She started sending out her own emails to extended family, painting me as some bitter, exaggerating child who was holding on to the past. She tried to spin it as if I was making a big deal out of nothing, twisting the narrative into one where she had simply made a few parenting mistakes. But this time, no one was buying it. Instead of siding with her, most of the family now saw my parents for who they really were. The ignored messages, the favoritism, the missing wedding, it was all documented. So my mother tried one last thing, a public apology. A long, overly dramatic Facebook post went up, filled with vague wording. She wrote about how she wasn't a perfect parent and how some people take things out of proportion. It was a classic non-apology, a way to make herself look like the victim while still refusing to take any real responsibility. I didn't even have to respond, because everyone else did. People started calling her out in the comments. Distant relatives started questioning her. Some of her own friends were openly disagreeing with her, saying that if she had really cared, she would have shown up to my wedding. But I wasn't done. I posted receipts. Screenshots of texts they ignored. A picture of my wedding day, with the glaringly empty seats where my family should have been. Proof that for months, they never even tried to reach out. And that was it. More people cut them off. Family group chats that once included my mother removed her. Invitations that once went out to them suddenly disappeared. And Ryan? He was spiraling. The HR meeting happened. No one knows exactly what was said, but whatever it wasn't good. A week later, word got around that he had been put on probation. Another angry call came in, but I didn't answer. The next message I got from my mother was her last, one final desperate attempt at guilt-tripping me. "You'll regret this when we're gone." I didn't respond, because for the first time I realized something. I wasn't doing this for revenge. I was making sure they finally felt the consequences of their actions. And it was working. The fallout wasn't just social, it was financial, and the cracks started showing fast. A call came in from an uncle I hadn't spoken to in years. He wasn't reaching out to guilt me, but to warn me. My parents weren't as stable as they had made it seem. They had been struggling financially for a while, but instead of cutting back, they had poured everything into Ryan, keeping up the illusion that he was successful. It turned out that Ryan hadn't been paying his own rent at all. My parents had been covering it the whole time, along with his car payments, credit card debt, and whatever else he couldn't handle on his own. The money they were spending on him wasn't just casual help, it was their retirement fund. They had banked everything on Ryan eventually becoming successful enough to take care of them. Except, he never did. And now, with his job on shaky ground and their social circle turning against them, the financial house of cards was collapsing. Ryan's job probation meant he wasn't getting bonuses anymore. Without his usual paycheck, he couldn't cover his lifestyle. The rent on his apartment was due, and this time, my parents couldn't step in. Then, the first eviction notice came. His landlord wasn't interested in excuses. With rent prices going up and no guarantee of payment, Ryan was put on a final warning. If he didn't come up with the money soon, he was out. Meanwhile, my parents were facing their own nightmare. They couldn't keep up with their mortgage anymore. The loss of social standing had impacted more than just their friendships. It had hit their business connections too. My father had always prided himself on his reputation in the community, using his standing to keep his side gigs going. But now, the invitations had stopped coming. People weren't eager to work with someone whose personal life was a disaster. Then the house went up for sale. The place I had grown up in, the house where I had been treated like an afterthought, had been under financial strain for a while. Between their reliance on credit cards to support Ryan's lifestyle and my father's dwindling income, foreclosure was inevitable. They tried to hold on, even borrowing from old friends, but with their reputation damaged and their safety net gone, they were forced to downsize, moving into a much smaller home in a less desirable neighborhood. The kind of move that screamed, "We're struggling," even if they refused to admit it out loud. That's when I got the email. A long, emotional plea from my mother, disguised as a message of reconciliation. She didn't apologize, of course. Instead, she focused on how family should stick together, how no matter what, we'll always be connected, and how I was doing so well now and could help them through this tough time. I didn't hesitate. I replied with one sentence. "I thought you said I was being dramatic and overreacting? If you can't take responsibility for what you did, why should I take responsibility for you now?" Then I blocked her email. The meltdown was immediate. She tried reaching me through other numbers, leaving voicemails filled with rage, calling me ungrateful, accusing me of abandoning my own family, claiming that one day, I'd regret this. I didn't respond. Then Ryan tried. Unlike my mother, he didn't waste time pretending to be nice. His message was blunt: "You wouldn't let your brother be homeless, would you?" As if he had ever cared when I was struggling. I picked up the phone for the first time in weeks and said one sentence before hanging up: "You never cared when I had to fend for myself. Welcome to my world." Click. Blocked. The situation only got worse for them. People in their social circle started whispering. The news of their financial issues spread, but instead of sympathy, it became gossip. People talked about how they had brought it on themselves, how they had burned bridges for Ryan, how they had betrayed their own daughter and ended up with nothing. I had my suspicions. The way my parents had clung to their old social circles, the desperation in my mother's texts, it all hinted at something more than just embarrassment. Then, another call came in from my uncle. This time he confirmed it. They weren't just struggling socially, they were drowning financially. They had relied on Ryan to be their golden ticket, but his failure and their lost reputation had left them with nothing. That's when my father, the man who had never fought for me, never defended me, finally broke his silence. It's a single message. I hope you're happy now. No apology, no accountability, just blame. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Because for the first time in my life, I felt something I had never felt before when it came to them. Nothing at all. No guilt. No sadness. No regret. Just relief. I turned to Ethan that night and said, I'm officially done with them. No more looking back. No more hoping they'd change. And for the first time in my life, I meant it. Ryan's eviction notice wasn't immediate. At first, he tried negotiating, pleading for more time, hoping that anyone would step in to cover him. But when the final warning came and the landlord wasn't budging, reality finally hit. This time, there was no last-minute miracle. No sudden money from my parents. No one to bail him out. The landlord followed through. Ryan was kicked out of his apartment, bags in hand, with nowhere to go. His first instinct was the same as always, run back to mommy and daddy. But this time, they barely had enough to cover their own rent. The new place they had downsized to wasn't big, wasn't nice, and most importantly, wasn't free. They couldn't afford to support Ryan anymore. And for the first time in his life, he was forced to figure things out on his own. He tried couch surfing. A friend let him crash for a few nights, but Ryan was Ryan, entitled, demanding, acting like he was doing them a favor by staying there. It didn't last. One by one, every option dried up. The messages from my mother slowed, but they never stopped. At first, it was anger, then guilt, then silence. And then, out of nowhere, a final, desperate email. Not an angry voicemail, not a passive-aggressive jab, just a simple plea. Please. We have nothing left. We need you not. I'm sorry. Not we were wrong. Just we need you. I read it once. Then again. Then for the last time ever, I responded. You made your choice. Now live with it. And then, I blocked her. Emails, numbers, social media, everything. They no longer existed to me. And instead of guilt, I felt lighter than I ever had before. The silence was peaceful. No more unexpected calls, no more tense family holidays, no more waiting for an apology that was never going to come. I had finally cut the last string. Then came my father's last pathetic attempt at controlling the narrative, a Facebook post. Some long, dramatic rant about disrespectful children who abandon their family, about how kids today have no loyalty and only care about themselves. It sat there for days. Not a single like, not a single supportive comment. People had seen the truth. Meanwhile, Ryan's situation didn't collapse all at once. At first, he managed to convince a friend to let him crash on their couch for a few weeks. But his entitled attitude, complaining about the Wi-Fi, expecting food to be provided, wore thin fast. One by one, his options dried up. Even his closest friends started seeing through him. His entire life had been built around his parents covering for him, fixing things for him. But now, there was no safety net. And I wasn't the only one who saw it. My aunt and uncle, two people who had stayed quiet for a long time, reached out. Not to pressure me, not to guilt me, but to tell me something simple. We're proud of you. They had watched it all unfold. They had known my parents weren't great, but they never realized just how bad it had been. And now, they saw it clearly. And that was all I needed to hear. The months passed, and something strange happened. For the first time in my life, I wasn't dreading the holidays. No awkward family dinners. No waiting for a call that wasn't coming. Just peace. Then, one day, I did something I never thought I would. I went back to my wedding venue. I stood in the same spot where I had looked out at the empty seats that were meant for my family. I took a photo, standing right there, with those seats behind me. And this time, I smiled, because they were the ones missing out, not me. Ethan noticed it first. You've never looked this happy before. And he was right. Without them in my life, I was thriving. A month later, I hit a huge milestone at work. A big promotion. A career move I had worked my ass off for. Once upon a time, I would have called my parents, told them the good news, waited for some kind of pride, some kind of validation. But now, I didn't even think about calling them. They had been erased from my world. Of course, my mother couldn't let things end that cleanly. A new email came through. Not from her usual account, she knew she was blocked. This time, it was from a distant cousin. I opened it, scanned the first line, and immediately recognized my mother's wording. Deleted. No hesitation. No curiosity. No second thought. She had already said everything that mattered. Nothing. And Ryan? Last I heard, he had to move out of state to find work. No more easy rides. No more parents covering his mess. No one cared. And that was it. Looking back, I realized something. I never needed revenge. I just needed them to finally experience the consequences of their own actions. And they did. Even after cutting them off, the messages didn't stop. New numbers, unknown contacts, some guilt-trippy, some outright hostile. The pattern was always the same. First came the family is forever lines trying to manipulate me into responding. When that didn't work, the messages turned nasty. I ignored them all. Then, a cousin reached out with something interesting. My mother had made a fake Facebook account. Apparently, she wasn't handling being blocked well, so she did what desperate people do, created a profile under a random name and started lurking. She wasn't subtle either. She kept posting vague, cryptic statuses like, some people just don't understand what family means. People weren't stupid. It didn't take long for mutual friends to piece it together. Some even called her out in the comments. The account disappeared not long after. But Ryan? He tried something even more ridiculous. He went full victim mode. Out of nowhere, he posted a long, dramatic rant on his real social media, flipping the narrative completely. According to him, I had ruined his life and abandoned my family for no reason. He painted himself as a devoted brother who had always tried to support me and acted like I was the selfish one for cutting them off. It backfired spectacularly. The internet doesn't forget. People, some from our old social circles, some total strangers, dragged him in the comments. His past behavior, his entitlement, the fact that he had mooched off my parents for years, it all came out. Instead of sympathy, he got humiliated. And I didn't say a word. I ignored his post completely. No acknowledgement, no response. Nothing infuriates narcissists more than being ignored. Then, late one night, a random number called. I let it go to voicemail. A single message. My dad's voice. "We need to talk. It's urgent." I stared at my phone for a long moment before texting back. "What's wrong?" Not even a minute passed before another text came through, but not from my dad. It was my mom's number. "Oh, thank God, you're finally coming to your senses." There it was. The bait and switch. I already knew what this was about, but I waited. Another message. Not a health emergency. Not a family tragedy. A financial crisis. They were out of money. My dad had been struggling to keep up with bills. My mom's reputation was in the gutter, meaning her old support network had dried up. Ryan's eviction had already happened, and now, with nowhere left to turn, they were begging me for help. Just a little help. "We're family. We need you," I replied with one sentence. "You never treated me like family. You don't get to ask me for anything now." Silence. Then, the breakdown. The messages came rapid fire, one after another. My mother lost it, flipping between guilt-tripping and full-blown rage. "How could you do this? You're selfish. You'll regret this one day." Then my dad called again. This time I picked up. He started talking, but I didn't let him finish. "You only care because you have nothing left. That's not love. That's desperation." Then I hung up, blocked every new number they tried reaching me from. That night, Ethan and I went out to dinner. We toasted to something that had been a long time coming. Peace. No more unwanted messages. No more guilt. No more guilt. No more waiting for something that was never going to come. A few weeks later, a cousin confirmed what I already knew. My parents had to sell the house. The house where I had grown up feeling like a second-class family member. The house where Ryan had been spoiled and handed everything. While I had to work for every little thing I had, they lost it. And I felt nothing, because they had made their choice. And now, they were living with it. Ryan's downfall was inevitable. His job had put him on probation after the fallout from my viral post. But everyone knew what that really meant. It wasn't a second chance. It was the company waiting for the right moment to cut him loose. And that moment came. HR finally pulled the trigger. Ryan was officially fired. No more cushy paycheck. No more pretending to be successful. Nothing. That's when the couch surfing phase began. He started bouncing between friends' places, but Ryan was Ryan. Lazy, entitled, and unbearable to live with. He wouldn't pitch in for groceries. He wouldn't help clean. He acted like crashing on someone's couch was his right, not a favor. One by one, people kicked him out. With nowhere else to turn, he tried guilt-tripping our extended family. Aunts, uncles, even distant cousins. He spun the same old sob story. "Natalie abandoned us. My parents are struggling. I just need a place to get back on my feet." Nobody took him in. By now, the family knew the truth. They had seen the way he was coddled, the way my parents had thrown their own retirement away for him. Nobody was going to repeat their mistake. With the guilt-tripping failing, Ryan tried one last social media pity party. A long-winded post about how families should never turn their backs on each other, how he'd been left with nothing, how his own sister ruined his life. It was the exact same playbook my mom had tried. And just like hers, it failed. People remembered who he was. They remembered the entitled, arrogant guy who never worked for anything. The guy who bragged about being better than everyone, who treated people like they were beneath him. The comments tore him apart. Instead of sympathy, he got mocked. Then, silence. No more sob stories. No more fake narratives. Just a public humiliation that he couldn't erase. Meanwhile, my parents had become pariahs. Once, they had a strong social circle. Friends, neighbors, even their church community. But after everything that had come out, that support vanished. Nobody invited them to events anymore. The church, which my mother had relied on for validation, had turned their backs on her. People stopped returning her calls. Even her closest friends distanced themselves. Then came the ultimate humiliation. A family wedding. A big one. The kind of event where my mother would have once been front and center, playing the role of the respected matriarch. But this time, nobody cared that she was there. She tried acting like nothing had happened, smiling, making small talk, inserting herself into conversations. But people ignored her. Not in a cruel way, not in an obvious way, just in a way that let her know she wasn't welcome anymore. A few people gave her fake smiles, the kind you give to someone you don't respect but also don't want to make a scene with. She left early. Then I saw a photo of my dad. A random picture that made its way to me through family. He looked different, older, tired, defeated. The weight of everything, the financial ruin, the social exile, the loss of control, was written all over his face. Then the final blow hit. With nowhere else to go, Ryan moved back in with them. 3 people, broke, bitter, and barely scraping by, trapped under the same roof. A family built on favoritism, now turning on each other. And me? I felt nothing. I had expected to feel triumphant, to feel like I had won. But mostly, I just felt free, because they had no control over me anymore. Then Ryan sent his last message ever. A single text. "I can't believe you're just watching us suffer like this." I stared at it for a second. Then I typed back one last reply. "Welcome to my childhood. Blocked. Forever." Then I did something I never thought I'd do. I deleted every last contact from my phone. My parents, Ryan. Every number, every email, every trace of them. They didn't exist in my world anymore. And for the first time in my life, I was finally truly free. A cousin reached out for what would be the final update I'd ever receive about them. My parents had officially hit rock bottom. The house was gone, their savings were drained, and they had no choice but to move into a tiny, run-down apartment, the kind of place they used to scoff at. The golden child was still with them. Ryan, once the center of their world, was now a grown man with no job, no prospects, and no way out. He was stuck in a dead-end life, completely dependent on two parents who barely had anything left to give. The family had cut them off completely. No more holiday invites, no more birthday parties, no more fake smiles at weddings and reunions. They had alienated everyone. Even their old friends had moved on. Nobody wanted to be associated with them anymore. Meanwhile, I was thriving. Another promotion, more traveling, the kind of life I used to dream about when I was younger, stuck in a house where I was constantly overlooked. Then something poetic happened. One of my best friends got married. This time, there were no empty seats, no disappointment. I stood beside someone who valued me, who wanted me there. The wedding was beautiful, full of love, laughter, and real family. I didn't spare my parents a single thought. At the reception, Ethan leaned over and said, "I've never seen you this happy before." And he was right. The holidays came and went. No unwanted calls. No awkward conversations. Just peace. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel that familiar pang of sadness when family gatherings rolled around. Because the truth was, I wasn't alone. I had a husband who adored me, friends who were like siblings, a real family that I built for myself. Then, therapy gave me the final answer I never realized I needed. It wasn't me. It was never me. I had spent so much of my life thinking that if I just tried harder, if I just earned it, maybe they would have loved me the way they loved Ryan. But the truth? They were never capable of love to begin with. I stopped checking for updates on them after that. Their lives? Not my concern. I had bigger things to focus on, like the family I was about to build. Ethan and I started talking about the future, about kids, about what kind of parents we wanted to be. And we both agreed we would never be like them. Then one last unexpected thing happened. A package arrived. No return address. Just a plain, old box. Inside, a collection of childhood photos, old pictures of me at Christmas, birthday parties, random family moments that I barely remembered, and buried beneath it all, a letter. From my mother. I didn't open it. I didn't even hesitate. I picked up the box and tossed it straight into the trash. No curiosity, no second thoughts. Because at that moment, I knew it was truly over. They were nothing to me anymore. And the best part, they had done it to themselves. They had made their choice. And now, I was living my best life while they faded into irrelevance. I'm Sophia, 28F, and for as long as I can remember, my family has treated me like I'm nothing more than a clueless airhead. It never mattered that I worked hard, that I was independent, or that I had built something of my own. In their eyes, I would always be the dumb little sister who didn't understand how the real world worked. Meanwhile, my older brother, Ethan, 32M, was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, despite being lazy, reckless, and entitled. My grandfather built our family business from the ground up, intending it to be a lasting legacy. But over the years, my parents took control, eventually handing the reins to Ethan. Under his reckless leadership, the company became a personal piggy bank rather than the empire it was meant to be. Every bad decision they made, every irresponsible financial move, was swept under the rug because, in their eyes, money would always be there. The business could never fail, at least, that's what they believed. I wasn't even considered part of the equation. I put myself through college on a scholarship, got a good job, and built my own investments on the side. I wasn't living a flashy life, but I was financially stable. My family, however, assumed I was struggling because I wasn't constantly flaunting wealth like Ethan. To them, the fact that I wasn't obsessed with appearances meant I was barely getting by. Ethan, on the other hand, was given everything. He never worked a real job outside of our family business. He spent money like it was infinite, constantly taking out loans under the assumption that our parents would cover him. Expensive cars, luxury vacations, overpriced watches, he lived like he was royalty. I knew the business was struggling, even if no one wanted to admit it. Suppliers weren't being paid on time, employees were quitting over missed paychecks, and there were whispers that banks had started denying loan applications. But if I brought it up, I was dismissed. "You wouldn't understand," my dad would say. "Business is complicated." Then I found out something that made my stomach drop. My parents had rewritten their will. Nearly everything, our childhood home, the company, the remaining assets, was going to Ethan. They had made their decision a long time ago. Ethan would inherit it all, while I was expected to fend for myself. Their reasoning: Sophia wouldn't know what to do with it anyway. It was almost laughable. They thought I was too clueless to handle money while Ethan was bleeding the company dry. I stopped trying to argue. Instead, I let them believe what they wanted. I acted uninterested in the business, like I had no clue how finances worked. I nodded along when they spoke down to me, let them believe I was just some naive little girl with no ambition. And while they were busy underestimating me, I started gathering information. What they didn't know was that I had been making my own investments for years. I had built a strong portfolio, grown my savings, and positioned myself in a way that I didn't need their money. While they assumed I was struggling, I was actually in a better financial position than any of them. Then, a friend of mine who worked in finance confirmed my suspicions. The business was on the verge of collapse. Ethan had taken out massive loans under the company's name, defaulted on several payments, and had multiple pending lawsuits. The only reason it hadn't completely crumbled was that my parents were still desperately throwing money at the problem, hoping it would fix itself. But the banks had finally caught on. Ethan was getting rejected for loans left and right. The business was too risky, his personal credit was destroyed, and even private investors wanted nothing to do with him. That's when my parents started making little comments, not outright asking for money, because that would mean admitting they needed my help, but hinting at it. My mom mentioned how family supports each other. My dad talked about unexpected struggles and how it was important to stick together during tough times. Ethan, of course, didn't say a word. He was still operating under the belief that everything would work out for him in the end. Then, my parents hit me with a bombshell. They weren't just struggling, they were desperate. They finally admitted that they needed financial help. But instead of asking nicely, instead of acknowledging that they had dismissed me for years, they made it sound like an obligation, like it was my duty to step in and hand over my savings to fix their mess. It wasn't even a request. It was an expectation. That's when I made my decision. I wasn't going to refuse outright. No, that would be too easy. If I said no now, they'd just keep trying to manipulate me. They'd guilt trip, pressure, and make me the villain for abandoning family. Instead, I played dumb. I acted hesitant, like I wasn't sure how finances worked. I told them I needed time to figure things out, that I wanted to understand what was going on before I committed to anything. They bought it immediately. Ethan even laughed, telling me not to stress myself too much over the complicated business stuff. I smiled, nodded, and pretended to be the naive little sister they always saw me as. But behind the scenes, I was already setting my revenge in motion. I agreed to help, but with a catch. Ethan and my parents were eager, assuming I'd just hand over money without asking questions. Instead, I told them I wanted to understand how the business works before investing. I acted unsure, saying things like, I don't know much about finance, but if I'm putting my savings into this, I should probably learn, right? Ethan barely held in a laugh. He actually found it funny. Sure, why not? He said, waving me off like I was a child playing pretend. My parents looked relieved, thinking I was finally trusting them with my future. They handed over the company's financial records, not expecting me to actually go through them. I was supposed to skim, nod along, and then hand over my money like a good little sister. Instead, I spent hours reviewing everything. The mess was even worse than I had imagined. There were massive debts, some dating back years. Suppliers hadn't been paid on time. Multiple lawsuits were pending from vendors who had been strung along with false promises. Ethan had taken out massive loans using the business as collateral, assuming the company would always make enough money to cover them. He wasn't just burning through money, he was gambling with it, assuming he'd win every time. I kept my face blank when I returned the documents. Wow, I said, sounding impressed. I had no idea running a business was so complicated. You guys are amazing for handling all of this. Ethan smirked, eating up the fake praise. My parents looked proud, like they had finally gotten me to see the hard work they put in. What they didn't know was that I had already found a way in. There was a legal loophole, small but powerful. Decades ago, my grandfather had issued shares to early investors, some of whom had long since passed away or moved on without claiming ownership. The records were buried in outdated company filings, overlooked because my family had never expected anyone to dig into them. Through a series of discrete transactions and shell companies, I gradually acquired control over these forgotten shares, increasing my stake without raising suspicion. My family had never considered this possibility because, in their minds, I wasn't interested in business. They assumed I'd never look into ownership. But with each share I acquired, I gained more control. To strategize my next moves, I reached out to Daniel, a forensic accountant specializing in corporate fraud. He had spent years uncovering financial mismanagement for major firms, and I knew if anyone could help me expose Ethan's mess, it was him. I framed my inquiry as a simple investment question, but I knew he would dig deeper. He reviewed the numbers and immediately warned me. The company wasn't just struggling, it was one bad decision away from total collapse. The debt was deeper than what had been reported. And worst of all, Ethan had been forging documents to make the business appear more profitable than it was. Investors had been misled. If anyone looked too closely, everything would fall apart. Ethan had built a house of cards and was acting like it was indestructible. Meanwhile, he continued his reckless spending. He bought a new car, claiming it was an investment in his image. He took another vacation, posting pictures in luxury resorts. I watched silently as he dug himself deeper. As I deliberated over my investment, my parents started pushing harder. At first, they framed it as a small contribution to help the family. But within days, it turned into pressure to cover major expenses: the mortgage, payroll, Ethan's business trips. They assumed I wouldn't question it. I played along. I told them I was interested in investing, but I wanted to sit down and discuss terms first. I framed it like I was just trying to be responsible, like I needed reassurance that everything was secure before making such a big move. They jumped at the chance. Ethan and my parents scheduled a meeting, clearly convinced they were about to manipulate me into handing over my money. Ethan looked smug. My parents looked relieved. They thought they had won. Then Daniel dropped another bombshell. Buried in the financial documents, he found something even worse. My parents had signed a contract using their house as collateral for one of Ethan's loans. There had been multiple late payment warnings from the bank, letters, emails, even calls they had ignored, believing Ethan would fix things at the last minute like he always did. But this time, the bank had run out of patience. The foreclosure process had already begun. Ethan was on a sinking ship, and my parents were tied to it. Quietly, I started reaching out to remaining investors, asking neutral questions about the company's future. I didn't say much, but I didn't have to. The numbers were already making them nervous. Ethan, oblivious as ever, kept treating me like a joke. He still assumed I was too naive to understand the situation. That's when I played my first real card. At the next meeting, I sat across from them, smiled, and said I was ready to invest, but under one condition. I wanted a major stake in the company. For the first time, they hesitated. Ethan scoffed but didn't outright refuse. He still believed he was in control, assuming I was too naive to know what I was asking for. My parents, blinded by desperation, convinced him it was just a technicality, they'd manipulate me later. After a long silence, they agreed, thinking they had outsmarted me. They had no idea they had just sealed their own downfall. They thought they could manipulate me later. They had no idea what they had just done. The moment the paperwork was signed, everything changed. I was no longer just Ethan's dumb little sister who didn't understand business. I was now a major shareholder, legally entitled to review financials, approve decisions, and, most importantly, make changes. Ethan barely paid attention when I took my seat at the table, still convinced I was just playing pretend. My parents looked relieved, thinking I was finally stepping in to help the family. None of them realized they had just handed me the power to destroy them. I wasted no time. The next day, I hired an external auditor, someone with no connections to my family, someone who would go through every financial record with a fine-tooth comb. As expected, red flags started popping up everywhere. Unreported debts, falsified profit margins, missing funds that had been funneled into Ethan's personal spending. By the time the first audit report came in, Ethan had started to realize something was off. He tried to play it cool, brushing off concerns in meetings, making up excuses for accounting errors, but behind the scenes, he was scrambling. Documents were being shredded, emails were being deleted. It didn't matter. The damage was done. Word got out fast. Investors who had already been uneasy started pulling out. Suppliers stopped offering extensions. Employees whispered in break rooms. The cracks in Ethan's empire weren't just showing, they were widening by the second. To control the narrative, I made my next move. I arranged a formal company statement, positioning myself as the one working to save the business. I didn't mention Ethan by name, but the message was clear. Under new management, things would improve. The employees, who had been mistreated by Ethan for years, took notice. Meetings started running smoother. Payroll became a priority again. I made it clear that incompetence wouldn't be tolerated anymore. The shift in loyalty was almost instant. Ethan, realizing that people were starting to side with me, tried to assert control. He called for an emergency restructuring, attempting to strip my decision-making power. But he had made one crucial mistake. He had already signed over shares. He couldn't override me. Then, the legal problems started rolling in. The fraud Daniel and I uncovered wasn't just internal mismanagement, it was serious. Investors who had been misled started filing complaints. The bank, now fully aware of the situation, moved forward with repossessing our parents' house. That's when the desperation hit. My parents, who had spent years treating me like an afterthought, were now scrambling. The moment their credit cards stopped working, the moment the foreclosure notices arrived, they panicked. Not because they realized they had been wrong, but because they had finally run out of ways to ignore reality. And now they wanted me to clean up their mess. It wasn't even phrased like a request. You need to fix this. You're part of this family. You owe us. Even in crisis, they couldn't bring themselves to treat me as an equal. I pretended to be conflicted. I let them believe I was struggling with the decision, that I was considering stepping in to save them. All the while, I was finalizing my revenge. Ethan, in one last desperate move, decided to fight back. He filed a lawsuit against me, claiming that I had misrepresented the nature of the investment and pressured him into signing away company shares. In his arrogance, he assumed the court would sympathize with him, not realizing that doing so would require opening the company's financial records that would expose the full extent of his fraud. It was a fatal miscalculation. It was a mistake. The lawsuit meant financial records had to be examined. Every document, every signature, every transaction Ethan had tried to hide was now in the hands of legal professionals. When the court saw what was really going on, they dismissed his case so fast it was almost embarrassing. Instead of saving him, the lawsuit exposed him. Now, there was no denying it. He had been committing fraud. The fallout was immediate. The last remaining investors pulled out. Creditors came knocking. The company's stock plummeted. Employees who had stayed loyal to him finally saw the truth. And then, the eviction notice arrived. My parents, still clinging to the belief that things would somehow turn around, were forced to face reality. The bank was taking the house. They had no savings left. Ethan had burned through everything. For the first time, they understood what was happening. And for the first time, they turned to me with real fear in their eyes. I could have stopped it. I could have stepped in, paid off their debts, saved the business, let them keep their home. But I didn't. They had made their choices. Now, they had to live with them. The fallout from Ethan's lawsuit was fast and brutal. Investors backed out, suppliers cut ties, and the remaining employees started looking for a way out. The company's name was now tied to fraud and mismanagement, and no one wanted to be the last one holding the bag. Ethan snapped. At the office, he had a full-blown meltdown in front of everyone. He screamed at the staff, accused them of being ungrateful, and went on a rant about how I was the reason everything was collapsing. He was used to being untouchable, used to people bending over backward to clean up his messes. Now, there was no one left to save him. It was time to finish what I started. I called for an emergency board meeting. As a major shareholder, I had the right to demand a vote on Ethan's leadership. It wasn't even a debate. Every remaining board member had seen the financial disaster he created. The vote was unanimous. Ethan was officially removed from the company. He tried to fight it. He tried arguing, threatening, even throwing out some last-minute promises to turn things around. But it was too late. His name was already toxic, and no one was willing to go down with him. The second he lost his position, everything started crumbling around him. The banks, already wary of his financial situation, wasted no time. His car was repossessed in the middle of the day, right outside the office. Employees watched as a tow truck hauled away his luxury SUV, one of many expensive toys he had bought on credit. Instead of taking responsibility, he did what he always did. He blamed me. The smear campaign started immediately. Ethan called every extended family member, spinning the story in his favor. In his version, I was the one who had manipulated my way into the company. I had stolen from the family. I was the reason our parents were struggling. My parents predictably took his side. They told everyone that I was a traitor, that I had abandoned my own family just when they needed me most. They left out the part where they had rewritten the will to give Ethan everything. They left out the part where he had gambled away the company's future. At first, I ignored it. I knew how my family worked. They thought if they spread the right rumors, they could guilt me into giving in. But karma worked faster than expected. Ethan's landlord, seeing the financial chaos surrounding him, decided to cut his losses. With no job, no income, and no access to quick cash, Ethan struggled to make rent. His landlord, already aware of his financial troubles, refused to grant an extension. With eviction looming, Ethan tried stalling with fake promises of a business deal that never materialized. Eventually, he had no choice. He packed up what little he had left and moved out in disgrace. And his credit? It tanked. By now, I had enough. I wasn't just going to sit back and let him drag me down with him. I called my lawyer and filed a formal fraud complaint against him. Not only did this protect me legally, but it also forced an even deeper investigation into his actions. Now, Now, it wasn't just the investors watching him, it was law enforcement. That's when my parents showed up at my doorstep. They were desperate. No more passive-aggressive guilt trips. No more offhand comments about helping family. They stood there, pleading, begging me to let Ethan back into the company, to give him another chance. They still believed he could be saved. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I just told them, you made your choice. Now live with it. Then I shut the door in their faces. The tide started turning. Extended family who had originally bought into Ethan's sob story began changing their tune. The lawsuit had backfired. His fraud was now public record. His eviction wasn't just gossip, it was proof that he had failed. Then, in a final act of desperation, Ethan tried to pull off one last scheme. He attempted to illegally sell off company assets, furniture, equipment, anything he could get his hands on, to cover his debts. He figured since he had always been in charge, no one would stop him. But I had already locked down all major transactions. His attempted sale was blocked immediately, and word got out that he had tried to cash out before everything crashed. If there was any last bit of credibility he had left, it was gone. The lawsuit he had filed against me was officially thrown out, and with that, his last hope of clawing his way back into power disappeared. It was time to make it official. I released a public statement announcing that the company was restructuring under new leadership. No direct mention of Ethan, no drama, just a professional, clean break from the disaster he had created. Investors, seeing that he was no longer involved, started cautiously re-engaging. Employees who had been uncertain now saw a future without Ethan running things into the ground. Meanwhile, Ethan was completely cut off. No home, no job, no money, and officially blacklisted in business circles. He had nothing left. And I wasn't done yet. Even after Ethan lost everything, my parents still refused to see reality. They believed, without a doubt, that he would somehow bounce back, that he would fix this, that he would rebuild his reputation. It was just a rough patch. They convinced themselves that if they just supported him a little longer, he would be back on top. And to them, I was the reason he was struggling. They told anyone who would listen that I had betrayed the family, that I had taken advantage of Ethan when he was at his lowest, that I had turned on them on my own blood when they needed me most. But none of that mattered, because now I had full control. With Ethan out, I made my next move, a complete restructuring of the company. And that included removing every single person who had enabled him. That meant my parents. For decades, they had treated the company like a personal ATM, draining it without a second thought. They assumed they would have control for life, that no matter what happened, they would always have access to company funds. Not anymore. The day the paperwork was finalized, they were officially stripped of all decision-making power. Their names were removed from every financial account, every board position, every single piece of influence they had clung to. They were furious. They demanded meetings. They called, they emailed, they even tried to storm into the office, but security turned them away. And then, the real consequences hit. Without access to company money, their spending came to a sudden halt. The unpaid luxury purchases, the designer clothes, the expensive dinners, the weekend getaways started piling up. Creditors, who had previously been patient because of the family name, now wanted payment immediately. And worst of all, their house, the one they had always bragged about, the one they had put up as collateral for Ethan's loans, was about to be foreclosed on. They hadn't made a mortgage payment in months, assuming I would step in and take care of it, assuming I would bail them out. Now, the bank was taking action. That's when the calls started pouring in. First, it was my mother, acting like nothing had happened. She brought up childhood memories, tried to guilt-trip me, talking about family bonds and how no matter what, we were supposed to stand by each other. Then my father, taking a different approach. He tried to lecture me, saying I was being short-sighted and that one day, I'd regret turning my back on my own blood. When neither of those worked, they escalated. Extended family members started calling, some trying to shame me, others acting as if they were neutral parties, just hoping I would do the right thing. It was obvious my parents had gone to them, spinning the same sob story they had been telling everyone else. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I just reminded them my parents had never supported me, not once. And then I hung up. The fallout was fast. Word spread quickly within their social circle. Suddenly, people who once admired them, the ones who had envied their wealth, their lifestyle, saw them for what they really were, failures. And nobody wanted to be associated with them anymore. Then came my final move. As the bank prepared to auction off their house, I worked through a third-party investor to place a bid, ensuring my name wouldn't appear on any documents they would see. The purchase went through quietly, hidden behind layers of legal formalities. They only found out the truth when they tried to negotiate with the new owner and realized they were talking to me. The realization hit them like a ton of bricks. They were homeless, and the person who now owned their former home, me, they begged, pleaded, offered to forgive everything if I would just let them move back in. My mother swore she had never meant the things she said. My father promised they had learned their lesson. I refused. Instead, I rented it out to another family, and my parents were forced to watch strangers live in the house they had once rolled over. Meanwhile, Ethan continued his downward spiral. At first, he tried couch surfing with friends, but word had already spread he was a financial disaster, the kind of person who would take and take until there was nothing left. One by one, people cut him off. And then, my parents did something I knew was coming. They showed up at my door. This was their last move, their final chance to convince me to forgive and forget. My father swallowed his pride, my mother forced a smile, both of them acting as if everything could still be fixed. But there was nothing left to fix. They had made it clear my entire life that I was never good enough for them, that I was second place to Ethan, that my success didn't matter, that I would never be their first choice. Now, they needed me. And I walked away. For the first time in my life, I was truly free. With Ethan and my parents completely out of the picture, I turned my full attention to the company. For years, they had run it like a personal cash machine, bleeding it dry, ignoring its potential, and treating employees like disposable workers. Now, with no more reckless spending, no more fraud, and no more entitled management, I had the chance to rebuild it the way it should have been all along. The first thing I did was clean house. Every single person who had been complicit in Ethan's mess, his yes men, his enablers, the ones who looked the other way while he stole from the company, were fired. Some tried to fight back, others tried to guilt trip me into keeping them on, but I didn't entertain it. They were out. Then I focused on the employees who had been loyal, the ones who had stuck it out despite Ethan's mismanagement, the ones who had been ignored and overworked. I met with them, listened to their concerns, and restructured the company from the ground up. Better leadership, smarter investments, actual financial accountability. And within a year, the company was thriving. Profits hit record highs. The business that Ethan had nearly run into the ground was now more successful than ever. Investors returned, partnerships strengthened, and the company's reputation, once tainted by Ethan's failures, was now seen as a powerhouse. Employees, once overworked and underpaid, now had stability and real leadership. And they knew it. They openly celebrated the changes, some even going as far as to say that Ethan being removed was the best thing to ever happen to the company. Meanwhile, Ethan was burning every bridge. He tried finding work in the industry, but no one wanted to hire him. His reputation was ruined. Too many people had seen what he had done to our company, and no one wanted to take that risk. At first, he refused to accept reality. He still carried himself like the same arrogant golden boy, assuming that if he just found the right opportunity, everything would go back to the way it was. But the job offers never came. The few friends who had supported him slowly started distancing themselves. He burned through whatever little money he had left, and with no income, his options dried up fast. My parents weren't doing much better. For the first time in their lives, they had to live without luxury. No more house, no more business funds, no more easy money. They were forced to downsize, moving into a small, modest apartment, cutting out all the luxuries they had once bragged about. They had never had to live within their means before, and the adjustment was brutal. Then, the apologies started rolling in. Extended family members, the same ones who had taken Ethan's side, who had called me a traitor for not bailing him out, began reaching out. They had seen the truth. They had watched Ethan self-destruct. They had watched my parents make excuse after excuse. And they had watched me take a dying business and turn it into a success. Some apologized outright. Others tried to reconnect subtly, as if they had never taken a side. I didn't hold grudges, but I wasn't naive. I forgave some, but I never let them close again. Then Ethan made one last embarrassing attempt at clawing his way back. Desperate to prove he was still business-minded, he tried starting his own company. He had no funding, no business knowledge, no investors willing to back him. But he pushed forward anyway, convinced that if I could do it, he could do it better. It crashed within months. The failure was so public, so humiliating, that even business circles started mocking it. The very people who had once praised him were now laughing at him. And for the first time, my parents realized they had bet on the wrong child. They had spent years pushing me aside, treating me like an afterthought while Ethan wasted everything they had given him. Now, I was the one who had built something. I was the one succeeding. And Ethan? He was a nobody. With no job, no business, no reputation, and no family support left, he completely disappeared from their social circles. And I was free. I had the company. I had success. I had built my own life without them. One day, I ran into an old family friend, someone who had once been close with my parents, someone who had heard everything over the years. They mentioned that my parents regretted everything, that they now saw their mistakes, that they wished they had done things differently. They asked if it was too late for them to fix things. I just smiled and walked away because I had already built a life without them, and I wouldn't change a thing. Ethan had lost everything, his job, his reputation, his apartment, and any shred of credibility he once had. But he wasn't done trying to drag me down with him. Desperate, he made one last attempt at salvaging his mess. He tried to blackmail me. Through a mutual contact, he claimed he had evidence that I had manipulated my way into power, that I had tricked him into signing away his shares, that I had orchestrated the entire downfall of the family business. The threat was laughable. I hadn't done anything illegal, just been smarter than him. Every contract was legally binding. Every transaction had been above board, and every move I made had been backed by solid business decisions. Instead of engaging, I had my lawyer send him a cease and desist letter. The message was clear. Any false claims would result in a defamation lawsuit. Ethan, realizing he had no real leverage, went quiet for about a week. Then, his next embarrassing stunt surfaced. He started a GoFundMe. The title? Victim of Corporate Sabotage, Help Me Rebuild My Life. In his sob story, he painted himself as a hardworking businessman who had been betrayed by his own sister, stripped of everything, and left with no way to start over. He begged for donations, claiming he just needed a little help to get back on his feet. No one donated. People mocked him. Old business associates, former employees, even distant acquaintances started commenting, calling him out for ruining his own life. Screenshots of his luxury vacations, his reckless spending, and the fraud he committed were reposted in the comments. The fundraiser was up for a few days before he deleted it in humiliation. With no money, he tried applying for corporate jobs. No company wanted him. His resume was a disaster, his reputation even worse. No one was going to hire a man who had been publicly ousted from his own family's business due to fraud. Every interview ended the same way, rejection after rejection. Meanwhile, my parents had been holding on to the last bit of hope that Ethan would somehow turn things around. But watching him fail over and over again finally made something click for them. For the first time, they realized they had bet on the wrong child. And just like Ethan, they turned to the only option they had left, me. They showed up at my office. Not unannounced, I had security instructions to keep them from causing a scene, but they requested a meeting. I agreed. Not because I wanted to help them, but because I wanted to help them. But because I wanted to see exactly how far they had fallen. They were polite. Too polite. For the first time in my life, they weren't speaking to me with condescension. They asked me for jobs. My own parents, who had spent years dismissing me, belittling me, and treating me like I was nothing, were now asking me to hire them. I didn't hesitate. I told them, I only hire people who take responsibility for their failures. They tried to convince me. They apologized. They said they finally understood my value, that they had been wrong, that they regretted everything. But I could see right through them. They didn't respect me. They needed me. And now that they had nothing left, they thought they could rewrite history. I told them to leave and never come back. Without my help, they had no options left. The last thing I heard, they had moved into a tiny apartment, far from the luxury they had once bragged about. And Ethan? With no job, no money, no home, and no family support left, he disappeared. Social media? Gone. Connections? Burned. No one knew where he went. And honestly, I didn't care. Ethan had already lost everything. His job, his home, his connections. But just when I thought he couldn't fall any further, his past came back to destroy whatever was left of his reputation. One of his former business partners, someone he had screwed over years ago, decided it was time for payback. Financial records, leaked emails, proof of how Ethan had manipulated numbers, faked profitability, and scammed investors into believing the company was thriving when it was on the verge of collapse. It didn't take long for the story to spread. At first, it stayed within industry circles, business professionals passing it around as a cautionary tale, but then a financial news outlet picked it up. And just like that, Ethan became a joke. People in the business world started mocking him publicly. His name was used as an example of what not to do. Memes were made, jokes were shared, and even former colleagues joined in, confirming just how reckless and incompetent he had been. And then, more people started coming forward. Former employees shared horror stories of how he had treated them. Unpaid wages, verbal abuse, blatant favoritism. Ex-girlfriends, once silent, began exposing his past behavior. Cheating, lies, manipulation. Even distant relatives who had cut him off years ago started speaking up, talking about how he had borrowed money and never paid it back, how he had always expected others to fix his problems. Any hope of rebuilding his name was gone. Meanwhile, my parents, they saw what was happening and panicked. They had spent years propping Ethan up, defending his actions, enabling his behavior. And now that he was a public disaster, they were scrambling to distance themselves. They told people they had no idea what Ethan had been doing, that they never supported his shady business practices, that they were victims of his deception, just like everyone else. Nobody believed them. The community saw right through them. These were the same parents who had handed Ethan everything, who had cut me out of the will, who had insisted that he was the only one capable of running the family business. Now they were paying the price for their blind loyalty. But I wasn't done yet. I wanted to erase every trace of their influence from my life. The family business still carried their name, a name that had been tainted by years of mismanagement. If I wanted to fully move forward, I needed to sever the final tie. So I rebranded. New name, new leadership, a fresh start with zero connection to the mess Ethan and my parents had created. And then I made my final public statement. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't vengeful. It was calm, professional, and brutally efficient. I stated that the company had successfully restructured after overcoming past mismanagement, that we had rebuilt a solid foundation for the future, and that we were moving forward with integrity and accountability. I never mentioned Ethan or my parents by name. I didn't have to. The message was clear: they were gone, and the company was better off without them. Ethan, still desperate to crawl his way back into relevance, made one last attempt to start over. He tried launching his own business. It was a disaster from the start. No investors wanted to touch him. No bank would approve a loan. The moment people heard his name attached to it, they walked away. Within months, it failed. The humiliation was so bad that even the people who had once supported him, his last few remaining allies, finally gave up. Then the final blow came. With no options left, no money, and nowhere to turn, Ethan officially filed for bankruptcy. He had nothing. No savings, no assets, no business. Meanwhile, my parents, their social standing was completely destroyed. They weren't just struggling financially, they were shunned. The same people they used to impress, the ones they had flaunted their wealth in front of, now wanted nothing to do with them. They lost everything: the house, the connections, the reputation they had built over years of looking down on others. And then in one last desperate move, they reached out to me. For the first time, they admitted they missed me. They didn't beg for money, didn't ask for help. They just said they regretted everything. I sent them one final message: you made your choices, now live with them. And then I blocked them forever. No second chances, no apologies. I had built a life without them, and I never looked back. Years passed, and Ethan remained exactly where he had left himself, at the bottom. He bounced from one failed scheme to another, desperately trying to regain the status he once had. And every few months, I'd hear about his latest attempt, a new business, a new hustle, some new big idea that was supposed to make him rich again. Every single one of them crashed. Investors still refused to touch him. Nobody in the business world wanted anything to do with him. He had burned too many bridges, ruined too many opportunities. With no steady income, he floated from place to place, relying on the few acquaintances who still pitied him enough to let him crash on their couches. And my parents? They had become ghosts. The people they once called friends, the ones they had flaunted their wealth to, the ones they had used to look down on others, had all moved on without them. They weren't invited to parties. They weren't part of any social gatherings. Nobody cared about them anymore. With no money, no influence, and no one left to impress, they faded into the background, forgotten by the very people they had once tried so hard to impress. Meanwhile, my life became everything they said I could never have. I bought my dream home, a place that was mine alone, free from their shadows. I traveled, experiencing the world in ways they never thought I would. I built a circle of genuine friends, people who cared about me, not about money or status. And the company, it flourished. Without their greed and incompetence holding it back, it grew stronger every year. Profits soared, partnerships thrived, and the employees, once miserable under Ethan's rule, flourished in a work environment that actually valued them. It became clear to everyone that the only thing truly holding the company back had been them. And despite everything, Ethan never changed. Occasionally, I'd hear from mutual contacts that he was still bitter, still trying to convince people that I had stolen from him, that I had ruined his life. But no one listened. Nobody cared about the opinion of a man who had lost everything by his own hand. And then, finally, my parents understood. I heard through distant relatives that, In their quiet moments, they admitted it. They had chosen the wrong child. They had spent their entire lives betting on Ethan, sacrificing everything to support him, and in the end, he had nothing to show for it. And I had everything. But by the time they realized their mistake, it didn't matter anymore. I no longer cared. The weight of their existence, of their judgments, of their expectations, it was all gone. I was free. They had destroyed themselves. I had never needed to seek revenge. I had never needed to ruin them. They had done it all on their own, and I never let them back in. Even when I knew they regretted everything, even when I knew they missed me, I never reached out. I never answered their messages. I never gave them a second chance. Instead, I built a life without them. A real family, one built on love and support, not greed and favoritism. And then, one day it happened. I ran into my father. It was at a store, an ordinary day, an ordinary moment. But as soon as I saw him, I knew. He looked old. Not just in age, but in spirit. He was a man who had lost everything, and had finally realized that nothing was coming to save him. His face lit up when he saw me, as if he thought, for just a second, that maybe this was his chance. He opened his mouth to speak. I didn't stop. I didn't stop. I didn't acknowledge him. I just walked past him, without a word, without a glance. I didn't need closure. I didn't need validation. I had already won. I was never the dumb one. I was just smarter than all of them.